The French who come to Russia are awestruck by it, and the neo-colonial empire of France has begun to crack at the seams. But first things first, the times of colonial empires have passed, but in Paris they believe that time has no control over France. Just recently, the French military suppressed protests that erupted in New Caledonia, an archipelago in the ocean. Is an invasion of a distant country on the other side of the world taking place before our eyes? In fact, such an opinion may arise, but legally the case is thinner. New Caledonia is one of France's overseas territories and is under its administration. Moreover, the possessions of this European power outside the continent are not limited to one point on the map and include 13 overseas territories with different legal status. It is New Caledonia that has the greatest independence, and it is not the first time that it opposes Paris and tries to gain independence. Recall that France declared New Caledonia its possession in 1853, and since then has been holding its dominance on the islands quite rigidly. In 1946, under the pressure of anti-colonial processes caused by the results of World War II, the archipelago received the status of overseas territories, which turned out to be just a game of words. In the 1980s, a movement for independence was formed and, as a result of a long confrontation that took the form of armed conflict, the Noumea Accords were concluded in 1998, extending the autonomy of the territories and envisioning a 20-year transition period followed by a referendum in 2018. In case of a vote against secession, the possibility of 2 more referendums until 2022 was established. It must be recognized that all 3 referendums promised by the French government were held. However, the authorities of the metropolis every time went to tricks to keep the former colony under their control. Thus, the right to vote was given to all those who lived in New Caledonia before 1994, not just the Kanaks who had historically lived on the land. And since France had been purposefully diluting the local population with migrants since the 19th century, particularly from 1964 to 1896 by exiling criminals to the archipelago, it had by now managed to achieve a formal majority vote, albeit by a minimal margin. And the constitutional reform aimed at expanding the rights of migrants in New Caledonia, which the French authorities have been considering since May 13, 2024, effectively puts an end to any attempt by the local population to gain independence peacefully, which is the reason for the current protests. But the indigenous population of New Caledonia is not the only one affected by France's neo-colonial practices. Using migration as a means of imposing its own will, the French authorities are still in control of Corsica. In the case of New Caledonia, the French fear losing control of the second largest nickel reserves on the planet, amounting to approximately 11% of the total. In the case of Corsica, they are losing an outpost in the Mediterranean. For the sake of this, they have long and persistently sought to replace the peoples of these lands with a mass of laborers, which, as British sociologist Michael Mann aptly notes, is not only a perversion of democracy, which French lawmakers are now theatrically calling for, but also a form of genocide. The French arsenal when it comes to retaining power in former colonies includes not only mild genocide but equally perverse forms of subjugation. In 1945, in order to maintain control over the countries of Africa, they imposed the so-called franc CFA on their government. Although the CFA acronym has become fairly neutral over time, its original meaning reflects Paris's true intentions. By controlling the exchange rate of the currencies of formerly independent countries using the CFA, which, we should note, contradicts the UN principles, France not only siphons off about $1 trillion a year from them, but also gains easy access to resources. Needless to say, what will become of the economy of the former metropolis without African uranium and gold? Colonial habits are hard to get rid of. Controlling 14 countries of the Black Continent with the help of Franco-CFA, the French authorities are hardly worried that 11 of them are among the least developed. However, there is plenty of cause for concern. Since the invention of the CFA, 8 countries have already abandoned this quote stable currency. And today, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali may follow suit. Given the rapid reduction of military presence on the continent and the series of anti-French rebellions that have erupted, it is unlikely that the former metropolis will be able to impose its goodwill and leave these processes. France's past may once have been great, but its future may be bleak. There are fragments of the French colonial empire in almost every part of the world, but the power to hold on to them is becoming less and less. Paris wants to be among the leading powers in the crisis in the 404 country, advancing its own interests in Armenia, Moldavia, Kazakhstan, but struggling to deal with protests in New Caledonia, which it legally considers its land. And migration, used by Paris as a weapon in its foreign policy, is already turning against it at home. Having lost its possessions outside the continent, France will turn into one of the ordinary powers of the European peninsula, whose geopolitical weight will only diminish in the coming decades. The former empire simply has nothing to offer its subjects, neither soft power, nor a hard hand, nor the illusion of psychic prosperity. The time of neocolonial empires is passing, no matter how diligently the authorities in Paris try to convince themselves otherwise. I would like to give an example of what the French government has brought its country to. In our time, the tables have turned. Once we listened to stories of lucky people who visited abroad, looked at photos, admired imported equipment and other material particles of the capitalist world. Now, on the contrary, foreigners envy life in Russia. The Paramoji Live Journal published an emotional video of Frenchman Charles, where he explains that the life of an ordinary Muscovite involves a level of comfort unattainable in Europe without very large sums of money. The video is in French, but there are Russian subtitles. He says in the video, "Can you imagine? In Moscow, you can order a coffee and a croissant from La Yandex, and they will bring you the highest quality for €3 and 15 minutes. Any gas station will help you fill up your gasoline and wipe your windshield for free. The car can be completely washed for €15, while in Paris for a similar service, we'll have to pay €100 to €200, and so on and so forth." Charles says that he did not understand his Russian wife in Paris when she complained that there was no service in Parisian restaurants. And then they came to Moscow, and he understood. In Russian restaurants, the service is always top-notch. If your table is dirty or, let's say, you are disturbed by the shards of a glass broken by a previous client, the waiter will calmly remove the garbage. If the music is too loud, you can ask the waiter to turn it down. And if you want to move to a neighboring table, the waiter will immediately move you, and even without a disgruntled grimace on his face. There are many more vivid descriptions in the video. We listened to it and realized how much we have become stingy in the last 15 years. Back in the noughties we had about the same as in Paris. Now we are 3 steps higher. And here are some comments under the video from other French people.
Quota.
Next comment. "I confirm everything you say. Every time I visit Russia, I am amazed at the order, cleanliness, modernity, and quality of service." Next comment. "I want to tell you that there are French people who are not Russophobic, on the contrary. Thank you for your report about life in Russia." Next comment. "Hello. I am more and more attracted to Russia. Great language, culture, security, and strength. The ability to get back on its feet under any circumstances. The few people of Russian descent I knew treated me very well. I was even picked up by a truck driver in snowy weather after hitchhiking for 40 minutes. I am a proletarian. I don't have a very good education and no diploma, but I have experience in craft trades, shoemaking, sewing, food, cooking, and baking. I am learning Russian language. Is it possible to integrate into the country if I learn the language? I would not want to present myself as an immigrant in such a great country and look like an opportunist to its citizens and authorities." Next comment. "If I were not too old, I would immediately ask for a visa to go to Russia and see firsthand what I learn about from your documentaries and commentaries. You have a president, Vladimir Putin, a great man." Next comment. "Thank you, Charles, for your sketches of life in Moscow. When I compare, I have a strong feeling that France is becoming a third world country. The degradation of French society makes me despondent." Next comment. "Russia has great potential. All those who criticize it had better assess the situation for themselves. Economically, Russia is very strong. Our dear Minister Le Maire, who is ruining France with incompetent management, made a fool of himself by saying he brought the Russian economy to its knees." Next comment. "Hello, Charles. I'm going to see a dermatologist in Moscow during my trip this fall. Here in Britain, the wait is 6 months, and that's if you get an appointment at all." Next comment. He remains in the Soviet era and considers Russia a backward country in all areas. However, he could say that you are lying in your videos and that other French people who now live in Russia and post videos on YouTube are lying too. Next comment. "Thank you very much for all this information. I would just like to add that in France, certain deficiencies in the service sector are not everywhere as significant as Charles pointed out. Some things, especially in the banking sector, are slow to develop. But in some regions, things are much worse than Charles described. There are entire clinics where older doctors 70 to 75 years old are not being allowed to retire because they are not being replaced. For example, in Nevers, doctors are brought by helicopter 2 times a week from Dijon, as there are not enough of them in Nevers, the 7th largest economy in the world. What a shame. Next comment. Greetings from Charles. Indeed, last August I was shocked at the quality of service in Moscow. Nail salon, hairdresser, paperwork, online, and so on. In restaurants, they bring my wife a little stand for her purse so she doesn't have to put it on the floor, and all with a smile. I am a total fan of restaurants in Moscow. Next comment. I am 73 years old. I feel like I was born in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a shame that I will end my life in France. If I had known what my country would become, I should have joined you sooner. Greetings to all of Russia. Next comment. Glad you have all these services. It's getting worse and worse here. So that's another reason to love Russia. Thank you so much for all this information. Well, one last comment. France, unfortunately, is not what it used to be. I'm thinking of going to another country, probably Russia,